Yes. So we can get started with the topic. What are we talking about when we say youth and e-cigarettes? Vaping and e-cigarettes, or e-cigarettes and youth. Doctor, you want to start us off?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about e-cigarettes, also known as INS, electronic nicotine delivery systems, it is a mechanism where you take a liquid and heat it up and aerosolize, and the person is inhaling that vapor or vape. So vaping, juuling, all of those are some slang terms for the use of e-cigarettes.
Right, there's many devices, as we know, in the market. There's devices. Does anybody else want to talk about some of the devices, what they've seen in just everyday life?
I think that most often I've seen juuling. That's the most popular one. People always talk about juul pods, social media, things like that really promote juuling specifically. But as people get more into that, it just progresses farther into, you know, having multiple vape products, things like that.
Right, and the Juul is that California company that just is the most popular, like you said, and it's very sleek and it doesn't create that much vapor, so teens are very, they use it, right? It's very prevalent. When we're talking about teens and using these products, of course, it's an alternative to traditional smoking, as the companies will say. What is the problem with regards to teens using Juul and e-cigarettes? Dr. Hulvershorn?
Yeah, so there's a few problems, but a big one is that there have been a number of good quality studies now that have shown that adolescents who use the e-cigarette products are much more likely to go on to use combustible nicotine products. So it's actually a gateway into tobacco, which is a big contrast to what is often heard in the media, that these are devices that are used to help quit smoking, which can be true, and there is data to support that as well, for adults or anybody really who's already smoking combustible cigarettes, cigars, things like that. They can help people quit those, but what we see more often is youth starting off with e-cigarettes and then escalating in increasing ways to combustible products, so yeah.
And we're talking about, does anybody have numbers? I mean, here in Indiana specifically, what is going on with regards to teens and youth using these products? Deb, do you want to?
Well, I don't have any numbers per se, but anecdotally, the numbers in middle school and even more so in high school are very high. I found some data from the CDC nationally that said in the past month, like 9.5% of 8th graders had used, 14% of 10th graders, and 16% of seniors. But the CDC also mentioned that the numbers are probably low because kids are self-reporting. They're not actually having studies done that show that people actually are doing it. The kids are self-reporting that they're doing it. So they're thinking that kids are not always telling the truth about how much they're using it. But just from talking to other school nurses around the state of Indiana, the numbers are frighteningly high.
Yeah. And just nationally, for teens, adolescents is around 21% of e-cigarette use, and from 2017 to 2018 we saw a jump of like almost 68% in usage. So our adolescents are comprising the biggest percentage as far as users of e-cigarettes. And again, what Dr. Hulvershorn said, initially when it was first created by a pharmacist in China in 2003, it was supposed to be to help adults who were addicted to combustible cigarettes, combustible tobacco use, to come off of that and as a safer alternative. Well, our adolescents, that's not what they're being used for. And so now this is a product that's introducing an avenue to nicotine addiction.
Olivia, you're kind of the youth, I guess, could be considered here at the table. What are you seeing? I mean, you're in college, but did you see this, and as you were leading into college or in college campus?
Yeah, so it became very popular my junior and senior year of high school, and I'm going to be a senior in college. So it's honestly just grown since then. When I was in high school, it was kind of like every couple of people were vaping or doing that, and now it's most people that I know. They're like, oh, it's like a jelly donut. That's what their flavor is, or it's something like that. And like walking through campus, you can't not walk through a vape cloud. And so it definitely affects like me, because I don't use, and it affects like the other the environment as a whole. People interrupting class, vaping in class, things like that. and it really just creates an environment where people are uncomfortable. So.
Do you want to talk about what your organization does on campus?
Yeah, so I am the president of Tobacco Free Blue at ISU. We currently have a tobacco policy that includes in designated areas where people can use tobacco use. But we're working on trying to get a comprehensive tobacco-free policy for campus so that we're getting rid of e-cigarettes, to all tobacco use, cigarettes, and all of that. And it really crosses over, you know, like sustainability, like that's cigarettes in general are just like garbage, things like that. But just the health overall for our faculty and staff and students. Yeah.
And you're also on campus, Dr. Hulvershorn. What have you been seeing lately?
Yeah, so I'm on a medical center campus, so there are patients and their families around, as well as students. And what I hear from my students is the same story, that everybody is vaping, and that some people vape with products that don't contain nicotine, others use nicotine, others add cannabis into the, and it's really hard to tell what's happening. And then we see still large numbers of patients and families in for treatment still smoking both e-cigarettes as well as combustible products all over the place. So it's a problem.
And specifically speaking about the vapors, you know, everybody, a lot of students are out there thinking that, oh, it's harmless. And we do know that even the flavorings, once it's heated up, it's combined with, it gets converted to what is toxic, and it's harmful to our lungs when we inhale it. And also in the aerosol, it's been shown to have the heavy metals like lead and copper, and that's thought to come from the coils. So it might start off with nicotine, or it might start off with something that they don't think is harmful, but once it's heated and becomes a vapor, is a different product, and it's been shown to be harmful.
Right, and we still don't know all of the effects of the vape and the secondhand vape. And like Dr. Hulvershorn said, a lot of the liquid that is being used in these devices, sometimes you know what's in them, and then sometimes you don't.
Right.
So can we talk about the nicotine levels? I mean, in my reporting was speaking with some of youth, you know, the high school students, and they had no idea how much nicotine was in these products. Dr. Stewart, you want to talk about what's in there?
Well, definitely nicotine is in a lot of the products, and we know that nicotine is addictive, and it can cause agitation. It definitely affects the developing brain, and so that's why there's a different effect of nicotine in our adolescence, so middle school, high school, and your brain develops until early to mid-20s, whereas you know, the effect of nicotine on the adult brain is totally different. So you're seeing it's affecting the prefrontal cortex, which handles our executive functioning, our attention ability. So kids who are trying to come off of it, they need that jelly donut. They need that fix, whether they want to believe they're addicted or not, because they started having withdrawals from nicotine, nausea, agitation, headaches, and on and on. And then we know that nicotine causes health problems like cardiovascular disease, vasoconstrictions, increased blood pressure. So there's a lot to it.
Seems like a lot. What about parents? Do we know anything about parents in schools especially?
Some of the things that I read when I was researching, you know, with some of the school nurses around the state, is that parents are just as clueless as the kids are. They're buying the fact that this is harmless, that it's safer than cigarettes. And I think parents are as much in need of education as the kids are, as their kids are. And parents are wanting information, and so this has exploded faster than research can keep up. So we need programs that are out there that can address this issue and provide this education for parents. But basically, they need to know the things that Dr. Stewart just talked about, that it isn't harmless, you know, that it truly is something that can lead to lifelong addiction issues. Many schools don't know how to deal with this. I'm talking about middle school, high schools, don't know how to deal with this because it's just been exploding so fast on them that they've kind of been caught with their pants down, so to speak. So it's been shown that punishment doesn't always work, and a lot of schools are handling it that way. If they can catch a child doing it, they get punished by suspension or expulsion, but that doesn't seem to solve the problem. So there's going to need to be a lot of research and work done to find out how do we...
Doing it on their way to class, they're doing it in the bathroom. So we can take a listen. This is Sasha and Taylor talking about their experience in high school.
Everyone at school has one, and they'll do it like if you just bend down and blow smoke under the table.
During school?
Yeah, 100%. In almost every class I'm in, someone's doing almost.
And the teachers know it's happening. Like, the teachers aren't stupid. It's not like they're just turning a blind eye, but at the same time, it happens so often with so many kids, there's not a lot. Can't kick everybody out of class.
So there you hear a student talking about the teachers know it's happening, kids are doing it in their school, they're blowing under their desk, they're blowing into their book bag, I've heard. And it's kind of, like you said, it kind of took schools by surprise, especially with the popularity in the last year. So any advice to the schools?
Well, some of the things that I've heard that have been somewhat successful is using peer-to-peer groups, so like using a basketball star, so to speak, or somebody that's a really good student, or somebody that the kids look up to, and going to middle school students and saying, hey, this isn't cool, and providing the education rather than parents preaching to them. It's been found that doing a whole assembly doesn't really do a whole lot, doesn't really make an impact on the kids at all. There are some interesting curriculums that are coming out, but I don't think anything's been really vetted yet as far as being really effective, and I think Dr. Hulvershorn has another comment about that.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly in the early stages of understanding how to make this better, for sure. I mean, honestly, I was searching on the National Institutes of Health website to see what's being funded, and there's not even a single clinical trial that's been funded yet on how to actually treat e-cigarette use, which is concerning. So the science is way behind. But if you look at the other areas of substance use disorder treatment and prevention, probably those same concepts will still work here. And so, historically, there's been a lot of, say no to drugs, the DARE programs, which initially were not found to be effective, right? And then the field has moved more to educating about health effects, and that is a little bit helpful. And then some more recent research is suggesting that adolescents in particular really resonate with this idea about they're being kind of taken advantage of by these companies, that they're kind of the victims here, and that if they really know more about the information about how they're being targeted and marketed towards, and they're kind of pawns in this corporate scheme, that actually really does not sit well with them. And so some research groups are really trying to focus on how to convey that information, accurate information that would make them say, wait a minute, this isn't something I want to be a part of. I don't like being used in that way. Here's an addictive drug that's being sold to me and marketed to my age group. That kind of thing might be kind of the future of where prevention goes to in part.
Right. Olivia, you had something was it an event that you held?
Yeah, so part of our work for Tobacco Free Blue is we focus on tobacco companies. They target various identity populations. And so we worked with the local chapter of NAACP at my campus and the Truth Initiative, and we hosted a town hall and talked about how tobacco companies target racial identities or people who have mental health issues or youth, things like that. They're targeting you because of these identities. And there's been different bills talked about, but we really focused on that group specifically because that's a big thing, with menthol and things like that. And so that absolutely goes along with youth being targeted. They don't make jelly donut vape flavoring for older adults. That's targeting youth and things like that. So.
And that goes along with the campaign that the NIH did for trying to stop the use of cigarettes, traditional cigarettes in the youth. And it was a very highly successful campaign. And so if I think that they should, or we should consider something like that and focusing on what you have seen.
Yeah. There's been lots of prevention work for decades trying to get the combustible cigarette rate down, like you're mentioning, that worked. So now it's just let's shift gears and try that again, maybe updating some strategies, but this has popped up and it's become much more of a problem.
Dr. Hulvershorn, I had gone on to the CDC site, And when looking up information about e-cigarettes, they list the quit lines, the 1-800 quit now. So if a adolescent were to call that number and say, hey, I want to stop vaping, would they be able to help them or guide them?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the idea is what we're assuming is that if we're going to treat e-cigarette addiction the same as other nicotine use disorders, and so we'll just use those same approaches. The problem is scientifically we don't know for sure if they work as well or if something different needs to happen. But for now, I think the recommendation by the CDC and other organizations is, yep, use your quit lines, use your nicotine replacement, use your same strategies you would use that if you were trying to quit smoking other kind of products, and those probably work pretty well, but we just don't have the science yet to know for sure.
And that's a good question. When I was doing this reporting, I came to this, as a health reporter, and you're thinking about public health, right? Traditional cigarette use is down, especially among youth. But now we have this other problem that kind of rose up. And I was thinking, maybe you start vaping or you try a Juul in high school, someone gave it to you or you tried it, and then you get to college and then you realize, what, this is, it's expensive, or I don't want to be tied to this anymore. Maybe you just realize it's not that great for you. And then you're trying to look for help with regards to how do I quit, right? And that's when I met Dr. Hulvershorn, and what is that solution, right? If a teen, maybe in high school, maybe in college, they want to quit, is it just easy, hey, let me get a patch or something like that?
Right.
What would you suggest?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research in this area around just quitting nicotine-related products, and the solution essentially, what the evidence base suggests, is using some form of behavioral intervention. There's a bunch of names for what that could look like, but the idea is deciding yourself that you're ready to quit, you pick a quit date, you want to do it, and you figure out what all the things are in your life that make it hard to quit. So if you're standing in the hall after school with your friends smoking there, then don't do that anymore. You locate opportunities to hang out with other people who aren't smoking. If you're, all the triggers. So there's this whole series of things that might make lead you to the path that would make it hard to quit, and you work on reducing those in your life, and then reinforcing all the reasons why it is a good idea to quit. It could take, honestly, if you really want to delve into it, it's probably an hour a week of sort of 8 to 12 weeks of working with someone if you want to do it right. So you can either see a professional, person who treats substance use disorders, and we would treat a nicotine addiction just like any other. If you came in with an alcohol problem, the treatment is more or less the same. Coupling that behavioral intervention with nicotine replacement is the gold standard. So that means you've got all these cravings that are just produced by the brain because it's used to receiving this very addictive substance. And so to work through the process, you have a period of time where you receive the nicotine replacement, whether it's a lozenge or a patch, and that has shown to be effective. There are other drugs on top that can work in the nicotine system, like Chantix, varenicline, or bupropion, Wellbutrin, that have also been shown to help. So you can use a combination of things. So most people try to just quit on their own cold turkey, right? They say, I'm just going to do it, and they might try many, 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 many times, and that's fine. And some people succeed. But if people are trying and trying and trying and it's not working, then getting in touch with a person who can do that behavioral intervention, and then the combination through their primary care doc or they're available over the counter. Getting that replacement. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but one easy and wonderful way to access that treatment is through the quit lines. The various states, in Indiana has 1-800-QUIT NOW, which is paid for by the state, and it provides at your fingertips free behavioral intervention to help you quit. So that's for adolescents and adults.
And one of the things I want to point out is because some people will be like, well, if you're going to prescribe a nicotine patch, well, I'm vaping nicotine, so what's the big deal? There's a difference in the delivery, and we know that the nicotine patch is exponentially safer than inhaling the nicotine, and so. And hopefully you're under the care of a physician, and combining that with behavioral modification to get to your end goal. So there is a difference between the nicotine that we see in our patches and our lozenges versus what people are supposed to in the vapors.
And something that we noticed at ISU is that people have like anxiety and things like that, and they're using vaping and even cigarette use, all of that, to cope with that. And so we had a program where we did stress relief events. And so I think part of when middle schools and high schools is focusing on like coping skills and like stress relief, self-care, and things like that at a younger age, so that they're prepared when they are faced with those challenges. Because I feel like they're not really prepared in those areas, so then it's an easy, quicker fix, but not long term.
Yeah. That's an interesting point that people have been, kind of mentioning this idea of like self-medicating almost, or even the idea that, well, I'm not addicted, I'm just using my Juul, what's the big deal? Is there anything with regards to, are we seeing that self-medicating, coping kind of mental health aspect of it?
Well, what we do see are that there are certain categories of psychiatric disorders that are much more likely to get involved with nicotine use. So, for example, people with schizophrenia, upwards of 90% of those people smoke cigarettes. And that is not a coincidence. There is a neurobiological reason for that. That's rare, though, in teenagers. So if we look at childhood or pre-adolescent predictors in terms of disorders, ADHD, actually, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is probably the biggest predictor. So if you have an 11-year-old at home that has an ADHD diagnosis, there are probably genetic reasons why that person is more reinforced by the nicotine when they try it, and also more interested in what that sensation might be like, a little more impulsive, a little less regulated. So let's try that. And also, people who are not worried about breaking the rules are much more likely to start off with any substances. Now with e-cigarettes, you're kind of, it's a little different because you're not really breaking the rules, and it's not illegal like cannabis or other drugs of abuse. So that may not be as strong. There's also interesting new research showing that individuals with a lot of early childhood adversity are more likely to engage in e-cigarette use, along with every other drug abuse. So I think getting whatever mental health issues are there treated is probably a smart strategy for parents who are looking to prevent, for sure.
And that's interesting, because I did, in my research too, read something about, I think California was using social emotional learning to help with prevention with kids with any kind of addiction. But
and Indiana's going crazy with that now.
That whole curriculum has come out now from the Department of Education to, so I think that's something that schools really need to look at and start using, to try to prevent, because there's not one way that's going to do it all, I don't think so.
And pediatricians are part of that frontline defense and offense, I would say, in trying to help kids, teach them how to cope and coping skills, and really making parents aware of some of the signs to look for. So like in my practice, Meadows Medical Center, I actually started youth and adolescent programs where they're small group settings to have kids express themselves, have a safe haven to express what they're dealing with, kind of learn from one another, kind of know that they're not the only one out there thinking that way. But then, does that really make sense? You're thinking this. What do you think? When you hear that person say that, what do you think? And they really can that doesn't. And so they learn from one another. And you, as the provider, you don't have to really say a lot because intuitively they, no, you're right. I shouldn't let that person or that situation get me so riled up, or make this bad decision. So it is anxiety, depression in adolescence. I mean, that was the impetus of me, because I was just, half of my pediatric practice was dealing with mental health and, issues on the primary care setting.
That brings up a good point of this kind of debate in people's minds, even their minds. When I was reporting and I was talking to somebody who used Juul at one point and then said, the nicotine level was too high, I was looking for something else, because they still wanted the vape, they still wanted the action of doing something. And then I was talking to his peers, and they were saying, people Juul or they vape, but if you become addicted, that's not cool. Then you become this like that you're dependent on it, and that's not cool. And then when people are trying it for the first time, they're having this debate in their own mind. They're like, well, it's legal. It might be legal in a couple years for me. You know, it's not an illegal drug. You know, my parents smoke. It's a safer alternative. So they're in their minds kind of, you know, deciding, do I want to do this? Do I want to not do, you know? So, I mean, especially in schools, I don't know if there's any anecdotes that you have from nurses that
well, you know, just anecdotally, like you mentioned, the nurses around the state are telling me that kids are coming in with symptoms of anxiety and nausea, and some of them have actually gotten THC or marijuana inside the vaping pens. And the level of marijuana is so much higher than you would find in the plant itself or if you would smoke a joint. And so the kids have been sent to the emergency room. But even if they just come in with anxiety, I think that nurse asking the questions like you were saying, or just trying to start a discussion about, you know, do you know that this is safe, or just kind of doing a lot of education one-to-one also. But it's getting scary out there. I mean, a lot of the nurses that I talk to are like, this is my #1 health issue right now. This is something that I'm really concerned about and we need to get a handle on.
Yeah. I just want to piggyback onto that comment. I think one assumption that a lot of people have is that, oh, okay, if we have a mental health problem and we're self-medicating with nicotine, it's going to make it better. And I think there is absolutely no evidence that e-cigarettes or other nicotine products improve any mental health condition at all. So in fact, things get worse, if anything, right? So people will tell you, well, I started doing it because I was depressed or I was anxious, or it's because their threshold for resisting lowers, right, because of their mental health condition. And so then they're more likely to try it, but that doesn't mean it's going to help them. But then because it happens to be addictive, they get stuck on it. And so the initial rationale for wanting to try it was because I want to feel better, I want to not feel depressed about this or that, or my ADHD is making it hard for me to focus, or whatever it is. And so it's logical to want to try something, but then what I'll hear a lot of people say, well, you know, now that I'm using, you know, I can't stop because I'll get anxious, and that's not because it's helping their disorder. That's because they're addicted to it, because it is, and you know, there's a reason why drug manufacturers put highly addictive substances into things they're trying to sell, right? And so they get hooked. And so most people actually find once they get through the quit phase, you know, the withdrawal and the uncomfortable phase of quitting, they actually feel a whole lot better. And then, okay, is your anxiety still there? Then let's treat it properly, you know, with therapy or medications that actually work for it. So that's, I think, a lot of people get stuck in that cycle of, well, it's going to help me, and then once they start, well, they feel bad because if they don't get a cigarette, then they're going to, you know, have all these symptoms. But that's not because they've treated their disorder.
Right, and it's almost, that goes back into like the character flaw idea that once you're, you know, substance abuse or something like that is like a character flaw instead of something you can just, you know, fix about yourself. When Deb mentioned, you know, what nurses are seeing in schools, what are we seeing with regards to hospitals and pediatricians with regards to vaping and e-cigarettes?
When I have now incorporated that as far as in the well-child check, asking questions about that, because no one's running to my office saying, hey, Dr. Stewart, I'm vaping, but I know it's out there. So that's when it comes to when you have a good rapport and relationship with your patient, then you can ask those tough questions and get honest answers from them and try to educate them. So really speaking to them, telling them what this really is about, it does resonate with them. Like, oh, I didn't know that. I mean, they really are naive when it comes to the effects of nicotine. And I'm like, you're being set up, and the big companies are getting richer, and your health and your welfare is being jeopardized. And so I'm not saying that they're like, oh, I've seen the light, and I'm not going to do it. But it starts the conversation, and so is making progress one step at a time.
Any extreme things happening, like at ER visits or people like with nausea? I mean, I guess there's some bad things happening.
Poison control numbers have just gone out the roof with, you know, accidental ingestions and little kids getting a hold of the capsules, the pods, and drinking concentrated nicotine, and heart rates and blood pressures going up. So yeah, there has been an exponential rise in ER visit and phone calls to the poison control centers.
And one of the nurses that kind of sent me a really long message, said what she's seeing consistently, maybe this is the THC-laced pods that they're getting, but is dilated pupils and just a really fast heart rate. And kids are freaking out because they feel horrible. You know, they just weren't prepared for this body effects that take a hold. And a lot of times she thinks it's like either the kids that are doing it for the first time and they get a hold of something like that, or else they're dabbing. I guess that's where you take like multiple hits at the same time. And it's really scary as a school nurse isolated in a education environment to have to deal with something that's basically can turn into an emergency event. So I mean, I think kids just don't realize how dangerous it can be.
And then they modify the devices, and so there's been explosions and burns that have sent the youth to the ER.
There's a lot of consequences that are going into that. And when we're talking here in the state, I mean, is there anything where we can educate parents even, right? I mean, a lot of the times, parents themselves find no answers, or they might think, well, my child isn't doing that, but we're seeing middle school students doing this. We're seeing a lot of high school students doing this. So if people are listening, you know, maybe you should have a conversation, but is there anything to facilitate that conversation out in the state?
Well, like I said, I think there's some curriculums coming out. I think if there is a school nurse at their school, they should start with that person, go to their pediatrician, like you mentioned, for information, and if they don't have it, hopefully they'll contact somebody like you or their association. The schools are scrambling, like I mentioned before, to try to come up with not only a policy but education, and I'm hoping that Department of Health and Department of Education in our state come out with some guidelines for schools to use. But there's really, I mean, everybody's just kind of, like I said, standing there kind of like they don't know what to do. I know, like I said, a lot of school nurses are really concerned about it and trying to come up with something, but it's hard to do it if you don't have evidence-based information to share. It's really hard to know where to start.
Yeah, I think the best approach at this point is to assume that this drug of abuse will be just like other drugs of abuse in terms of how we should address them. So the same approaches. And so in that case, I think the best resource is drugabuse.gov. This is the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, the federal agency that funds research into drug abuse treatment. And they have a section for parents, for teens, and it's specifically targeted at those groups with how to talk to your child, your teen about this. And I think what you don't want to do is start a really antagonistic, yelling at them kind of conversation, because nothing will shut down their openness faster than that. So the philosophy, that the term we use for it in the addiction treatment field is motivational interviewing. So it's this idea that you're trying to elicit change in the person themselves. So kind of what you're doing in your groups, in your practice, you want them to decide that that's the right thing for them to do. So how do you do that? You support their autonomy. You don't yell at them. You talk about their goals, where they want to be, and then let them jump to the conclusion about whether or not this is helpful or not to them. And so ideally, yelling at the kids when you find out what's going on, not helpful. However, once you figure it out, you want to facilitate a plan to help them and hold them accountable. This is not acceptable. I appreciate that you shared this information with me. I want to support you in this. This is not good for your health. And so what can we do to help you get there? And so that will include some close monitoring. So going through your kids' stuff, making sure they don't have paraphernalia for whatever it is. Because odds are, if there are nicotine-related products, you may find other things too that you don't want to have around the house. So there's a whole collection of approaches that are part of drug treatment for adolescents that are applied to the parents. And the main thing is knowing where your kid is, knowing what they're up to, knowing who they're with. If your kid's friends are using substances like e-cigarettes or others, chances are your kid will as well. And so getting them into activities, structured time that doesn't involve drugs of abuse is incredibly protective. And so there's decades of research showing things like showing animals at state fairs. What's that program?
4-H.
4-H, yeah. 4-H. 4-H. Kids who are involved in 4-H compared to kids who weren't are much less likely to use any substances. And so getting them in active time. And the question that you can ask parents that's most predictive of drug use later is, where are your kids after school? There's some really good research showing if parents don't know the answer to that question, the odds that their adolescent is using some sort of substance is really high. And so getting getting right on top of what are they doing, where are they, who are they with, and how can I get them in a sport, a music group, an activity, something that's focusing their time. So those are the most powerful things, I think, that unfortunately they're not cheap, and they require a lot of effort. So community responses that could be very helpful would be things like supporting activities for youth that help them, get rid of some of that unstructured time where they can, get into the things like this.
And I think even before they go to drugs.gov, the parents need to know that it is a drug.
Yeah.
I think that's a big misperception that parents don't even think that it's harmful.
Right.
So you got to start there, but then her ideas are just well placed.
And Araceli, in Kokomo, to educate the parents, Shirley DuBois with Tobacco Free in Kokomo joined up with Western School Corporation and had an educational session for parents to say, hey, this is what's really going on. You smell that bubblegum flavor? There's something more. There's something more to that. And so just having what you spoke to, more town hall meetings geared towards parents so that they can be educated about what their children are doing.
Well, and a lot of the times that when I was talking to parents or students, they were saying, if I caught my child with it, and they would say it's just water vapor. You don't have to worry about it. It's not a traditional cigarette, right? Or sometimes the parents themselves, they smoke traditional cigarettes, and so then they say, well, at least it's not a cigarette. I'm not going to get cancer, right? I don't know. It's a very difficult conversation that I think some parents are having or have to have at some point. And I guess what we got out of it is make sure you do your research. Yeah. How do you cope with it with other college students? So it's more of a peer-to-peer kind of conversation.
So I think that, just kind of framing it as like, it is a health risk, and you're affecting me as well, because people, they're like, oh, well, I'm making that decision for myself. I'm doing that. But when it starts to invade on other people's area and other people's health and things like that, I know I had a friend and they would vape around me and things like that, and I would start to get sore throats and things like that just being around them. And they always had one because they're doing that to themselves. But I was like, hey, I can't be around you if you're doing this because you're making me sick. And that goes along with secondhand smoke, but it's secondhand vaping. That's a thing. It's not water vapor, and that's a big misconception. I know when I was in high school, that's what everyone thought. Oh, it's just water vapor, but it's not regulated. There's people, anything could be in that, and you don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely not water vapor. That's a really good yeah, and this idea of I won't get cancer, we don't know. We would need decades of research, watching people grow up. Who knows what kind of throat, head and neck cancers could emerge from this epidemic. It's just, I wouldn't want to take the risk, personally.
And like I said, those chemicals are being modified. They're changed once this in that heating element, and so some of the acetylcholine and choline, those chemicals, those molecules have been known to be carcinogenic. So no, we don't have the research, but just like many moons ago, oh no, it doesn't cause you any harm. Smoke away. And then later on, we found out that the research was there and it was hidden for a while. We don't want to repeat history with e-cigarettes.
We do hear that a lot. It's a healthier alternative is how, the companies have spun it for adults, of course. They never intended for, they say they never intended for youth, but people say it's a healthier alternative. I'm not doing an illegal substance. I'm not doing anything wrong. So it is this kind of, now we have to rebuild that narrative, right, and put some information out there that really we just don't know.
Change
what
narrative.
what are the effects of this, I guess is a big question that we still need to answer.
It's not FDA approved for smoking cessation. The evidence is insufficient, and they do recommend it if you completely you're giving up smoking traditional tobacco products and you're replacing it completely with the e-cigarettes if you've already been addicted. But it's still, the studies are insufficient right now for the FDA approval for using e-cigarettes, and it's definitely not recommended if you've never started smoking in the first place.
Yeah, and even if you're an adult who is vaping, why would you want to go to a product that you might get hooked on for a long time when there are other treatments that work, that nicotine replacement plus behavioral interventions. It's not like we have nothing that works. We have good things that work. It's maybe hard to engage, find providers, all of that. But once you're really committed to doing it, lots of people successfully quit smoking combustibles without using e-cigarettes.
Yeah, and in the state, we saw some legislature, some things that didn't pass, some things that were presented, things like raising the age to 21, taxing some of the, the products, like tobacco products are also taxed. None of them actually came out, but what do you guys think about, raising the age to 21, or maybe putting a little bit more emphasis on how we regulate or what's in these products, right? So any thoughts?
I think definitely need to raise the age to 21, but what I'm reading and hearing is that it's easily bought online. So that's going to have to be tightened up. They raised the tax, maybe that'll make it a little bit more cost prohibitive. That's definitely something that I think we as a state, if we're interested in health at all, have to really consider for both cigarettes and for e-cigarettes as well. Those initiatives just didn't go anywhere in the last legislative session here in Indiana, which is a very sad statement. It's a big public health fail as far as I'm concerned. So I know there's some initiatives on the federal level as well. Yeah. I think maybe the federal level is going to have to lead the way. I'm not sure. I don't know what anybody else thinks about that, but
yeah, there's a lot of folks in the public health arena writing about banning the flavorings. So if they didn't taste good, if they weren't targeted at youth with these tasty flavors, maybe there wouldn't be as much incentive to use them. I think that could be very helpful potentially.
Yeah, I think raising the tax is honestly the way to go. People are going to make the decision to start, and then it is an addiction, but raising that, like, once you're in there, but raising the tax, money is where people, that's really hitting their pocket, that's where it really hurts. And so raising the tax, if it's less accessible, then it's less available, and then they're going to have to attempt to find other alternatives.
And then putting that tax money towards, prevention efforts so that the message is really clear.
Community efforts. And those things have been also mentioned about, making the community a little bit more. What are some alternatives, right? Yeah. So we're going to take some questions. If you're listening, you can submit your questions now. But before we take some of the questions, is there anything else that we forgot to mention in our conversation that you guys think it would be important to bring up?
I think we hit a lot of the points.
Yeah, we did. We did really well. So we have a comment. It says, the Quit line treats youth 13 to 17 years old with a specialized youth quit coach, and they can address behavioral issues and triggers, cravings, etc. So like we mentioned, that's a very good 1-800
Yeah, and
Quit
it's
Now.
free. You can call from your home. I mean, how convenient is that?
Yeah. It is, anywhere you want. In discussing vaping with my son, he asked this question: does nicotine have negative effects other than being addictive? That's a good question. Who wants to
Absolutely,
take that?
it does. It definitely changes your brain development. We know that it affects that. So we have nicotinic receptors in our brains, and so it. Now I don't want to get too heavy into the science of it, but yes, young man, it affects your brain. It affects your executive functioning. It affects your attention, and then, like we said, it can cause agitation. It can make your anxiety worse the longer and the more that you get addicted to it. So there's definitely significant health effects associated with nicotine use.
Yeah, and cardiovascular as well. You mentioned earlier, heart rate, blood pressure increases, which can be dangerous.
And you're learning. I mean, you're in school. Your big job when you're a youth is to learn, and it definitely, like you said, the executive function and the learning, it definitely has a big effect on kids' ability to learn. And if they're focusing on e-cigarettes or vaping, they're not focusing on why they're in school. But I loved Dr. Hulvershorn's comment about making sure your kids are involved in after-school activities. And as a 4-H person, I grew up with 4-H and showed animals and that sort of thing. I mean, it's so important to be involved with your kids' lives and to know what they're doing and to make sure that they're involved in activities where they have good influences with other kids that have like-minded interests and abilities. So.
Right. And if we're hearing that students are doing this in the classroom, I mean, you aren't thinking necessarily about what the teacher's saying. Maybe you're thinking about, let's wait till she turns around or he turns around so I can do this. So it even, I mean, the addictive part of it, I would say, is still very bad. The addictive use disorder, it's still bad. We'll take another one. I work with younger children in elementary schools, and they are beginning to ask about vapes and e-cigs because they see their parents using them. How do you suggest we address this at their age? So even younger, right? Even younger than middle school.
Yeah, this is such a challenge in the field, right? Because if there's one thing that will predict kids using, it's watching their parents use, watching the people they love, who they look up to, right? So it's, and the problem is parents get very defensive about this if you try to educate around, hey, you guys need to stop. But I think maybe a sophisticated approach would be to comment on the health effects of on the kids of the parents' use with the parents. So it's, because third-hand smoke, which is trapped in your clothes, is bad, right, for all sorts of respiratory issues. And then this, being around it secondhand-wise, obviously, they're directly inhaling this stuff that potentially is carcinogenic and causes respiratory problems and all of that. So that's one approach with the parents. But then, how do you not make the parents seem like horrible people to the kids, which is not helpful either. Right. So I think just sharing objective information to the kids about, well, this isn't healthy for us. It's especially unhelpful for young brains. So that's an approach I'll often take that kids will hear. No drug of abuse is great for an adult brain. I would rather no one use any drug of abuse ever, but they're particularly dangerous and bad for a developing brain. And so we could sort of take the parents out of the equation when talking to the kids and say, these are very, very dangerous for someone your age. Your brain is still developing, your body's still developing, and these are particularly dangerous for you. So we don't want you to be around them, and we certainly would never want you to use them, that kind of approach.
And speaking of a sophisticated approach, if we were able to educate the young kids about the effects of nicotine. Listen, I'm a parent, 4 daughters, I know, pray for me. We want to make positive change in our lives. If our kids, like, hey, mom, hey, dad, this is bad for you. And so we can make it where, the kids can have a positive peer pressure on their parents if it's presented in the right format.
The trick is not the defensives come up, so
absolutely.
so it's tricky to deliver that information in a way that parents aren't going to get defensive, but they'll hear it because basically they're doing something that's not great for their own health or their kids' health, and that's hard to admit.
But if I ask my parents, so do you smoke cigarettes? Yeah, doc, but I smoke outside. And do you take off and I take my jacket, I take my clothes, I wash my hands. Do you smoke in the car? Absolutely, I do not smoke in the car. Well, that type of absolutely. I don't smoke around my kids. I don't vape around my kids. Getting them educated so they're like, oh, absolutely, I don't vape around my kids. I would love for them to say I don't vape at all, but to at least see that, hey, there is secondhand, third-hand effects to the vaping.
And more importantly, the message that it's okay to vape, right? Which is, again, tricky to deliver that so you don't provoke the defenses, but.
And we haven't even talked about respiratory disease with parents that smoke or, so many kids have asthma. I mean, that's the #1 thing that school nurses deal with in schools, and just the effect of that secondhand and third-hand smoke is just, that could be a whole other show, really, but that's really, that's a way to, when parents say, well, why is my child's asthma so bad? And, I always respond, well, the smoke that's in the home is really hard on their lungs. So that's an avenue that, if that's the case, can be taken as well. So.
And we talked a little bit about the age limit, like if it were to raise to 21. What about the idea that what a lot of people are trying to do is to make sure that those fruity flavors, all the sweet stuff isn't actually put in these products. Do you guys think that would have an effect, especially on the younger children?
I think
potentially.
You spoke to that. Yeah.
Who knows until it happens, but I think it would likely be helpful. Yeah.
Well, and some of the companies are directly marketing to the students as well, and part of that is the flavors, I'm sure.
I'm sure the companies will fight that with every lobbying cent they have, so that will not be an easy battle.
Right, like they fought the cigarette tax being raised.
Right, and won.
And we didn't touch a lot on the fact that not only are nicotine-containing products being used, aerosolized, but others like K2 spice, other THC products, and so parents might think they're like, oh, it's just, you know, flavored water or a nicotine product, but it's been adulterized and used in a different way. So,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Commonly.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think as they get older, you know, you start off, you know, vaping or things like that, and then just you transition. Like we've all mentioned that, like it's kind of, we always say like cigarettes are a gateway drug, right? And it's just the same thing with vaping. It's just like the line, you can see it happening. I can see people going from vaping to smoking cigarettes to other more aggressive drugs that are already illegal. So yeah.
That has all to do with the reward pathway, right? You just have to have more and more. You have to just go to the next level, the next level, the next level.
Yeah. It's very hard, I think, for us to, especially to explain that to a young child or you know, a middle school student that's just kind of, you know, I mean, there's a lot going on already in middle school. Then you know, to have some of this stuff
and lots of anxiety in middle school. So that's certainly an age where you, and even if you can start in elementary and give them that idea, like you say, that that's bad. I mean, they've done that successfully with alcohol to a certain extent, because I see my granddaughters say, you shouldn't be drinking that. You know, you shouldn't drink anything. I mean, they've been. I think that pathway works, but we have to do the same thing with cigarettes and vaping as well. So.
And it's a complicated social hierarchy, right, in middle school and childhood, and a lot of it is trying to get to the top. And one way to do that, right, in some groups is to smoke and do things that are risky. And so that's a battle also that has to be waged, you know, with schools and parents to help them build skills, build confidence in other areas, so that it doesn't feel like the need to be the cool kid smoking too, which is tricky.
It's rough. I know. It's rough. It's hard. We all remember. Right?
It is.
Before I get to the last question, back to the schools, I think that one of the problems that we're seeing, especially right now, is the schools, they're reacting in this like normal, I think, school kind of way where it's like, you get caught and you're in trouble. You either get detention or it escalates to suspension or a parent has to come on and pick up your vape pen or Juul. But what happens after that, right? I think that's like a very common thing. What are your guys' suggestions for schools?
Well, what I saw was that I think Carmel Schools is doing this, where they're pairing the punishment with education. And I don't remember exactly if it's education just for the student. I think they should make the parent come too. And I'm not really sure how they're doing that exactly, but some schools are finally getting the idea that you can't just punish, you have to educate as well. And so that's one way that I've heard of.
Yeah, this comes up a lot in our adolescent substance practice, of course. And I think the best approach is close monitoring by the school. Brief, you know, punishment is fine. Brief, though, suspensions, expulsions for this is not helpful to anybody. And then in requiring treatment. And treatment programs that involve parents as well are helpful, and that's great. So I think what we don't want to see is, oh, you get kicked out of school, now you're expelled, which happens all the time.
Yes.
I saw a kid a couple weeks ago that got expelled for using an e-cigarette twice, got caught twice. And so now he's at home with nothing to do. Now he's at much greater risk for developing substance problems, mental health problems, than if he were in school, going to sports, doing all these things. So kicking a kid off the team they loved playing is not helpful for a long term. But but saying you've got to go to treatment. I want to see a completion certificate. I want to see that you've been participating and going, and I want your parent involved in this or that. That can be very helpful.
And do you see patients going in to try and stop their Juul or e-cigarette use?
Yeah. I mean, typically they're coming with other substances as well, but it is totally reasonable to consider entering into a substance treatment program if for something like the quit line wasn't helpful enough or whatever, to come to a specific treatment provider for a nicotine problem. Absolutely.
I think it's going to be very important. I mean, Indiana State, we're widespread. We've got a lot of rural areas that it's going to be very critical for pediatricians like myself in rural areas to combine with, to partner with addiction specialists like Dr. Hulvershorn, so that, because it is a big deal for parents to have to drive to Indianapolis. So we have to have resources, and like I said, pediatricians are on the front line, and usually they already have that relationship, that rapport. They've been taking care of Johnny since he was yay big, so I think that type of partnership will be very effective.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's actually a program that has just been funded that is going to be launched in August by myself and some colleagues at Riley. That is a telephone support line for pediatricians who want support from a psychiatrist doing mental health and addiction treatment. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, a lot of 30 some odd states have them, and this will be the start of ours. So
that's a great thing.
It'll be helpful for a lot of doctors.
That's breaking. No, it's not breaking probably.
But you heard it here.
Yeah.
While we're on the topic, are there anything else that people that are listening should look up, Google, or call to get more information, resources, especially around the state? You mentioned Kokomo has the program with
Shirley Du Bois,
Shirley,
as far as tobacco-free.
Yes.
Yeah. She's
So
very,
tobacco-free.
she's been very proactive. She's busy all over the place, and she reined me on in. So definitely, and you can contact me at meadowsmedicalcenter.com, and I can be a resource. Yeah.
So we mentioned 1-800-QUIT-NOW. The real cost campaign is what a lot of people are pushing to get the real effects of e-cigarette and vaping, especially among youth. That can be easily searched. Are there any others? I mean, your organization as well?
Yeah, so in the Terre Haute community, there's obviously Tobacco Free Blue, and then Libby Ray, she works with Chances and Services for Youth in the Terre Haute Vigo County community, and she works with Voice, I believe, and they do a lot of education as well. So yeah.
Dr. Hulvershorn, do you have anything?
Just that website, I can't speak enough about it, the drugabuse.gov, with tons of resources about not just e-cigarettes, but other drugs of abuse, information for parents and for youth. It can be brought into schools. It can be taken, they'll mail you 1,000 flyers if you want that, whatever you need. And that's really cutting edge science on what it's doing and how to help.
Yeah. So there are things out there.
Yeah, the cdc.gov / tobacco. They have some PDF and media marketing material. So they have, which I thought was really good. I'm like, I'm going to print this out and put it in. So it's like, you only have one brain, and so they have a vending machine with a whole bunch of different brains. You can't get a new brain. You only have one new brain. Yeah. So, and then they have audio of a parent and a child talking about the nicotine effects, and so I thought that was very effective. Yeah. So I thought the cdc.gov had some good resources for parents and students.
Yeah.
And I would just encourage parents to use sites that are well researched and vetted as well, because it's really easy in this day and age to go to sites that are sponsored by somebody or advertisements or that sort of thing. And that's one thing I found when I was a practicing school nurse. It's just hard to say to parents that, I mean, vaccinations is a whole nother area, but
my goodness, stop.
you know, but to go to something that's reputable, like Dr. Hulvershorn mentioned, or Dr. Stewart, that NHI, or some of those sites that are CDC that are well vetted. So that's a continuing battle with parents as well, as you know. So.
Yes. Well, we have a lot more to talk about, but we will wrap things up. If you like the topic and you want to hear more, you can, of course, visit sideeffectspublicmedia.org. We'll continue to follow this topic and stay with us. You can join our newsletter and email us anytime at health@wfyi.org. I will thank our guests again. We have Olivia Teague. Thank you for coming. Dr. Dana Stewart. We have Dr. Leslie Hulvershorn and Deb Robarge, right? I said it right.
Yes, you did.
Thank you so much. We can also, this link will be shareable, so you can share it with anybody that couldn't catch it today or right now. And thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for covering this topic.
Thank you.